Hey, everybody, it's Amanda Radke back for another episode of the Heart of Rural America podcast, the show where we highlight great people across rural America who are doing things to strengthen their family, their communities, and the agricultural industry that we love. I have two very special guests on the show with me today. In fact, I've been visiting with them for many months now about some issues that they're facing on their family's ranch on the Arizona Strip. And I finally got the chance to meet them in person. Social media makes the world a much smaller place, so that's always exciting. But I was speaking at the Utah Farm Bureau annual convention out in Provo, Utah, and got to meet our guests today. So Chris and Cassie Heaton, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us on, Amanda.
So I guess just to start, it was such a pleasure to meet you guys and to learn more about your family. Tell the listening audience who you are and what you do and your family's history in the cattle business.
Yeah, so like Amanda said, we're Chris and Cassie Heaton. We live down here in Kanab, Utah. We're in southern Utah. We're right on the Utah-Arizona border, and we ranch in northern Arizona on the land called the Arizona Strip. And that's the strip of land that's north of the Colorado River, the Grand Canyon, that runs up to the Utah state line. We have been there for many generations. I'm actually a sixth generation there on the Arizona Strip. My family came with some of the original settlers into the area and organized and put together a cattle ranch out there. And we've been there for a while. A lot of the land that we ranch on is federally owned now, BLM land. We do lease some state land from the state of Arizona. And then we do have a few thousand acres of private land that we ranch on. We have 4 kids, 2 girls, and then a boy, and then a girl. Yeah, so 2, 1, 2.
Wait, your count's
I forgot one.
Yeah, no. 2, 1, 1. Our kids' ages are 10, 8, 4, 6, and
You're
2.
Great.
So we've got a young family, and they obviously enjoy the ranching and farming life that we live. And it's very important to us. Our 10-year-old daughter's been doing all the fall roundups with us this year. It's not uncommon for us to do 20 miles a day on a horse, and she handles it like a champ. It's pretty impressive to watch her handle it.
And they're 7th generation. They're extremely involved in it, and we hope to keep preserving the land for them to be able to enjoy, and hopefully their kids too. So we love it here. It's our home.
So just to give us a general idea of where the Arizona Strip is, can you kind of explain it in relation to the Grand Canyon and then Salt Lake City up, by Provo, where we were at for that meeting? Kind of where are you nestled in there?
Yeah, so Provo is right about in the middle of the state of Utah, maybe a little on the north end of Utah, but about 4 hours south of Provo, a couple hundred miles is the state line, and we're in Kanab. So Kanab is right in the center of Utah, but on the Utah-Arizona state line.
Okay.
And then the Arizona Strip is just right below Kanab, and it goes to the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon's about 70 miles south of us. And then our ranch sits about 30 miles south of us, so about 30 miles into Arizona, and then about 40 or so miles from the Grand Canyon.
Okay. So one of the things I think about in the beef cattle industry is I hear people say, we're going to look like the chickens or the hogs in short time because of the vertical integration that's happening all over in agriculture. And yet one thing that I remain confident in is that we're still going to have to convert grass into beef. And the demographic of this nation is so different, or the geology, I should say, of how I ranch in South Dakota is so much different than what you guys are dealing with. And yet the ability for each individual to take the terrain and the environment that they're working with and upcycle that grass into the most nutrient dense food on the planet, it's incredible. So I guess I lead up to that asking, what are some of the challenges that you face ranching as far as water, terrain, drought? What does ranching look like for you guys there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Amanda. So we ranch in a high desert valley is what it's called. But elevation wise, we run anywhere from just over 4,000 feet above sea level to about 6,500 feet. So we're not a super high, but we're that high desert valley. We have a lot of grasslands. We have some sagebrush, some cactus, and for the most part, we run in pretty flat country, but we do have a lot of canyons. You know, we're on the north edge of the Grand Canyon. So we have Kanab Creek that comes down through Kanab where we live and ties into the Grand Canyon, and there's some other tributaries of the Grand Canyon. So we're in some pretty rough and rocky and cliffy country. We have a lot of big game, a lot of mule deer, a lot of antelope, a lot of bighorn sheep, and then obviously our predators are, you know, the coyotes and the mountain lions and bobcats.
I think another thing too that is maybe unique to some people, but there's no live water on Arizona Strip, so it's all comes through monsoon rain, and I think that poses its own risks and problems in and of itself. But that's something that we, you know, deal with and pay really close attention to. We don't have that live. I guess we have some springs, but not like running.
We don't have rivers and streams and creeks.
Right. Yeah.
And back in South Dakota, where you are, Amanda, you guys probably run so many cows per acre. Out in our country, it's so many acres per cow.
Exactly.
So we're pretty spread out in that desert country. We ranch on just under 50,000 acres, and that gets our herd to just under 300 head of cattle.
Okay.
So just for perspective, so when we do 20 miles, in a day on a horse, we do 20 miles a day on a horse because it takes that long to find everything.
Sure. Go back to the live water, because I have many listeners on the East Coast that this is like a brand new term. So what does the management look like for you guys? Are you capturing the water and then hauling it? Like what? And that's probably super naive. So I don't know. You tell me, what does that look like?
Yeah. So we have 33 stock ponds, and these are earth-built ponds that are fed by drainage ditches and washes. Okay. So when we get our heavy monsoons in the summer, they collect the water into these washes and then fill these dirt ponds. So, every few years we go in and we clean out the mud because we get a lot of sediment that runs into these ponds. We remove the mud so that we can hold as much water as we can. We have 6 wells that we've drilled. These wells are on private and federal and state land. They're a mix. And so we go through that permitting process. We get the water rights for those, and we drill those wells. Our wells are in shallow aquifers, mainly in the bottom of washes, but they don't pump a lot. We're very happy with 2 gallons a minute. We will take 2 gallons a minute all day. That's good water. And then we have a few springs that we've developed, and lately we've been building these water catchments. We've been working with the NRCS to build these water catchments. These water catchments are big black aprons. They're a tarp that we lay out over several 100 square feet. And then when it rains, it hits this tarp and then funnels down into a big tank, 100,000 gallon storage tank. And then we float off of it to tire troughs. And we've done about 5 of these in the last few years to help spread our cows out where areas that we don't necessarily have those dirt ponds.
So there's a lot of distinct differences, I suppose, between how we ranch up here in South Dakota and you guys, but probably the biggest one would be we're grazing on 100% privately owned land. So in many regards, we have a lot more control about land management and how we can graze and all of those things. And I imagine just looking at your guys' history, surviving and thriving and keeping a business together through 6, 7 generations. And that means many administration swings along the way and trying to be in alignment with all the state and federal regulations. Before we get to the current challenge you face, how has WOTUS impacted your guys' ability to operate as you see fit?
It makes it difficult for sure. Yeah. The thing that's so unique with running on federal land, and specifically with us and other ranchers, is so we've been here since the late 1800s. Mm-hmm. The BLM didn't exist until 1946. So my family's been running on this land for 50 years before the federal government even had any say or control or management plan for us. And we did a pretty dang good job of it because it was our business. And if we overgrazed or didn't utilize the water, then we would put ourselves out of business, and we didn't do that. So then when the BLM got involved in 1946, we continued to work with them. And we've had a pretty good working relationship with the BLM for years. My grandfather had a great relationship with his range cons that he worked with. My father did, and I think that we do too. The local BLM, the office that we deal with is based out of St. George, Utah, and they're great. They're hands on the ground. They meet us out there. They look at the problems, the concerns we have. They help us with the approvals of these new catchments that we're doing, and they've been pretty good to work with. The concern is on the those that are in DC or in a regional office somewhere. They don't see the ground. They don't know what we're doing. They frankly don't care, I believe. They don't look at what we're doing. They don't see the improvements that we've done. With regards back to the water a little bit, with regards to the water that we have, there's a lot of wildlife. I mentioned the wildlife. There's a ton of wildlife. Mm-hmm. Some of the big mule deer that's hunted in the state of Arizona come in and around our area. 13A, 13B, some of these units, there's some record bucks that come off of those, and they are watered by ranchers. If we weren't there maintaining water and improving, there wouldn't be those record mule deer. There wouldn't be that population, that hunting industry that is so important to our region and the state of Arizona.
There seems to be a misconception, if I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt that are on the environmental side of things and want to talk about conservation, I think there's good intentions there, but there is a huge misconception that leaving nature untouched is the best way to keep a pristine landscape. Whereas those of us that are involved in agriculture and mining and logging and all of those things understand that responsible land management reduces the spread of wildfires and promotes new growth. And much of the land where you're living on, where cattle are grazing, would be barren desert if ruminant animals weren't on there grazing. And then add in that it's protecting wildlife habitat. And I could go on. And well, I looked it up while we were visiting. It was because we had talked about this in Utah. I was like, who created the BLM? And it was President Truman in 1946. And in 2021, they celebrated 75 years. And today the BLM manages about 245 million acres of public landscapes for all Americans. And as I feel like I say this all the time now, but elections have consequences. And we currently have a president who, through his 30 by 30 plan, wants to put 30% more land in the federal government's control, which is expanding public ground, through private public partnerships, putting 30% more private land in control of the federal government. And to me, I don't know if we evaluate much of what the government does today. I don't think they're very efficient or very good at much. And so it's actually terrifying to see so much land being in the control of American citizens. And so I guess that leads me to what you're facing now under the current administration. Tell us what's going on with the ranch in regards to your access to some public ground.
Yeah. So early this spring, it was like March or April, we hear a rumor that the Biden administration is looking at creating a new national monument. And that would cover a portion of our ranch. And we're very familiar in our area with national monuments. Mm-hmm. Living in Kanab, we have the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument that's on our north and our east. It's 1.8 million acres that President Clinton designated a monument 20 years or so ago. We are familiar with the Bears Ears National Monument that President Obama did over in the Four Corners area of the state of Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. And, I can't remember exactly, 1.3 million acres, I want to say. And then they're looking at this one. And so we hear about this. And this is the Grand Canyon National Monument. And it's got a different name, but that's the gist of it. And with that monument, the proposed route at first was about 1.3 million acres. And it's from the Grand Canyon National Park to the Utah state line, essentially. And then there's the Kaibab National Forest that runs through it. So it was going to be on the east and west side, clear over to Lee's Ferry. And then it was going to be on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, just south of the national park, down towards the Flagstaff area. So that's the proposed route that they started with. That's ultimately what they finished with, but they did, chop it up a little bit. So we hear rumor about that. We heard rumor about it with Obama, and then it fizzled out. Mm-hmm. So we weren't that confident that something was coming. Rumors come and go. But then that was in like April-ish. Yeah, and our daughters had a little trip down to Disneyland. They went and danced down to Disneyland with their dance group. So we were heading down to Disneyland the first part of July. And I got a call from a friend and said, have you seen about this meeting that they're holding in Flagstaff on the monument that's going to be on your ranch? And I hadn't heard anything of it. I hurry up, got off the phone. I called the BLM office that I work with out of St. George, asked them about it. They didn't know about it, the guys that I spoke with. So we were just shocked, devastated. This is, Thursday, Friday, and this meeting was to be held the next Tuesday in Flagstaff. Flagstaff's 3.5, 4 hours away from us. So we did a little bit more digging. We found out about this meeting. We went down to Flagstaff, and they had a public meeting there to discuss the monument. There was only about 10 or so of us ranchers that were able to make it because it was pretty last minute. But they had the room filled with a bunch of others that were in support of this monument. They had plenty of notice, and they were there. And they had this public hearing. When we got up and expressed our concerns with the monument, at that time, that monument's boundaries was including over 1,000 acres of our private ground. Not let alone, our rights that we have for grazing on the federal land and our water rights that are on federal land, but our private property. So we were pretty frustrated and upset. That's the first time we saw the map.
So tell me what the implications would be if your private land was included as a part of this monument. How does that change your land?
We didn't know. And I was asking them, I said, what does this mean when you're taking private ground into a federal monument? Like, is this an eminent domain? Is this a taking? What are you doing?
Right.
And they couldn't answer anything. They had no clue. And I was a little frustrated, as you can imagine.
Yep.
And so at my public hearing, they allowed me 2 minutes to speak. And they're looking at taking 1,000+ acres of my private ground plus all the federal land that we lease. And they gave me 2 minutes to talk. And while I spoke, the audience booed me.
Wow. 2 minutes. Let's just reiterate 2 minutes to defend 7 generations of work.
Yeah.
Private land.
Yeah.
And the mob boos you.
And they booed me. And
expletives and you name it. And they were extremely disrespected. And on the flip side, when other people were, sharing support of the monument, the ranchers that were there were extremely respectful, never booed, never heckled, never said anything. But the respect was not both ways by any means.
It was sad. And I felt bad for the moderator. I really do. It was not her fault. She was trying to control a mob, for lack of a better word. But it was a pretty accurate word, I think, too.
So I want to give, just before we dive into this, I want to give a little context for people that don't understand how these monuments work, because I think this is a very foreign concept if you're not living in like near Yellowstone or Devil's Tower or wherever. So I looked it up while you were talking there, but so the National Park System was created by probably one of my favorite presidents, Teddy Roosevelt. I've got his speech, Daring Greatly, on my office wall, and I loved him because he busted up monopolies. We could really use that for the 85% control of our beef supply right now that we see. Like, I would love to see that. But on the flip side, he was the president that created the Antiquities Act in 1906 that allowed for presidents to proclaim lands or waters under federal jurisdiction as national monuments. So he created like Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming. And I looked it up. There's a total of 17 presidents representing both political parties that have used the Antiquities Act to create nearly 160 national monuments. And fun fact, I'll just run through it quick, but the presidents who have used this Antiquities Act the most, And by the way, again, I think it started with good intentions and now has been weaponized and hijacked to control more and more land. No surprise here, President Barack Obama created 29 monuments. He's number one, followed by Bill Clinton. He created 19 more monuments. Theodore Roosevelt created 18. Jimmy Carter, 15. Calvin Coolidge, 13. Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt created about a dozen. And then that would be your top 10 would be rounding out with William Howard Taft and Herbert Hoover. But it's just interesting to see that, there's only so much land in this country. And yet two of our most recent presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, were creating massive swaths of land that would go into these distinctions. So I think maybe think about that as we're moving forward, if you're listening to this and trying to understand kind of how the dynamics have changed with these monuments. So now you have an administration that's like, we're going to do this wide sweeping designation, and let's go back to where that puts you guys in this discussion.
Yeah. And down in Flagstaff, they had one of the big pushes for this Grand Canyon National Monument is to protect Native American sites, their ancestral lands. And I don't have a problem with protection of Native American sites. We have several sites on our ranch that we know about and no one else, because it's pretty remote, rugged country. And
sure.
So I've taken
There's
my
no
wife
signs on the interstate directing you to off-road and go see it.
There's nothing's posted on Instagram. It's not Insta famous, so it's not geotagged.
And we keep it. We're very careful around it. Our kids are very respectful of the land, with the artifacts, with the things we find. We are extremely respectful. We don't put it out there to the world. We feel that we are doing it justice by keeping it their sacred lands and not defiling it in any way. And we're really careful about that.
And so that's their big push to protect that. And I think that that's a good thing. I really do. I'm okay with preserving history, really. But there's a flip side to it. When President Obama created that Bears Ears National Monument over in the Four Corners area, he then put a lot of these sites unintentionally on the map because everyone said, hey, there's this new national monument. Let's go see it.
Sure.
Family vacation, COVID's hit. We're not traveling far. Let's drive over to Bears Ears. Then you put hundreds and thousands of people onto these big open areas, 1.3 million acres with all these 2-track roads going to these different sites. And there was nowhere to protect and preserve. They had 1 or 2 law enforcement officers covering the whole area. They graffitied. Lots of sites were damaged. They were graffitied. They were ruined. Human waste was a huge problem because they didn't have toilets. They didn't have restrooms set up for this big flux of people. And so to me, when they say they're creating these monuments to protect and preserve, I think they're doing the 100% opposite. And that causes great alarm to me for this new monument. We're in a really rough, remote area. Cass and I interviewed with Fox News right after the monument was created. And coming out, we helped some foreigners from Europe change their tire because they had never changed a tire before. And they're 30 miles from a pavement and in a rental car. And they were scared to death. And it was in July. It could have been very bad.
Yeah.
And so we're gonna open the door to this kind of stuff, and it's gonna create a strain on our local communities. So anyways, that's one of their big things. So they had this meeting in Flagstaff. It was a nightmare, to say the least. And then a few weeks later, we hear that President Biden's coming to Northern Arizona on a trip. And so we know it's coming.
Yeah.
We hear of the state of Arizona had 2 House committees and 1 Senate committee hold a last-minute meeting in Kingman, Arizona, which is in Mojave County. So in Arizona, the 2 counties that this monument affects are Coconino, which is Flagstaff is the county seat, and Mojave County. And our ranch is in Mojave County, but the capital seat is Kingman, which is down by, you go to Las Vegas and then Henderson and go straight east and you get over, and then you get over to Kingman. So they hold this hearing. We ran down to Kingman. We testified at those hearings on the concerns we have. At that time, they had came out with another map for the monument. This map still included our private ground, even after we met in Flagstaff and showed them our concerns. This second map still included it. So that meeting, not to get too political, but I was very, very disheartened with Arizona. Not one Democrat on those 3 committees showed up. And they took it political. And I don't think this is political. I think when Americans have private property and private water rights on the line, I think every party should be outraged that the federal government is going and trying to take these rights and this property, personal property from individuals, Americans. But they drew a line politically, and not one Democrat showed up. All the Republicans were there. They had the hearing, and they were very distraught from our testimony and from other ranchers' testimonies of what was really taking place. And they were concerned. They passed some resolutions in opposition to the monuments, or to that monument. But obviously the federal government didn't listen. The next morning, our president created the monument. Last minute, they did pull out some of our private ground, which was pretty impressive. We worked with a lady with the Department of Interior a little bit, emailed back and forth, and she was a champion of helping us remove some of our private ground from it. With that being said, some of the private was removed, but they still have not addressed our water rights. In the creation of the monument, they didn't address them. We have private water rights held on federal land, and those mean something. We have proofs of those clear back to the late 1800s. So anyways, the monument was created, and now we're in this waiting period. We don't know how it will affect us. We have no clue. There's no management plan in place. They're not talking to us. We can't get any answers. We don't know what's going on. It was created in August, first part of August, and we've heard nothing. And that's concerning. We have projects in the works to do improvements on federal land, to build some of these water catchments, these aprons to store and collect water. And we don't know where we stand. It's just in this funny limbo, and there's no plan in place. The concern we have too right now on the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which is just, outside of Kanab here, the federal government has got a new plan proposed, a management plan that is on the table right now. It just finished a public comment period, and now they're going to decide on what to do. And in that plan, they're proposing reducing 12,000 animal monthly units, with AUMs, and animal units per month. And what that'll do, that's about 2,000 cows that they're going to pull off of that monument, essentially.
Wow.
And there's about 600,000, 700,000 acres that they're going to say no more doing any improvements on this monument. So no more doing treatments for cedar trees and juniper trees. No more reseeding the ground. No more water improvements. And so our concern is with this national monument on our ranch, on the Grand Canyon National Monument, is what they're going to do is they're going to get us death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
Where they're going to come in and say, okay, and they promised when Bill Clinton created that Grand Staircase, he said, we're not going to reduce grazing. We're not going to touch it. Now, 20 years later, on the table, they're reducing it. There's about 68,000 AUMs on the Grand Staircase, and their proposal is to cut 12,000. That's a big reduction. And they said they'd never do that. And they've got support, and they're probably going to do it. And it's crazy when it doesn't affect them at all, and it doesn't hurt them at all, and it hurts us tremendously.
I feel like, and some of these things that we're seeing these are our friends and families that are in the same situation as us. Their family has been on this land since the early settlers, and that we're fearful for that, for our kids, for the next generation coming up, and the one after. And I think a big part of our frustration right now is that the communication has been little to none. And this is a big part of our livelihood. Mm-hmm. It's not only our way of life, but it is our livelihood. It's one way we feed our family, and it's our business. We pour everything into it, yet we're not being communicated with. We still don't quite know what the future holds for us and our ranch and our land. And what other business in America is being so overly regulated? And then on top of that, there's no communication on how this will affect us and our livelihood. And I don't know what more to say other than that. And it doesn't feel good to feel when your hands are tied with your own private business and no communication. We just know that we're at the mercy of the federal government, and it's not great.
Do you think, like, will you be able to run out the clock a little bit with, we all know we're going into an election year. If administrations change, does this all go away, or is this kind of led by the bureaucrats in these federal agencies that nobody elected, but they get to run terror and do what they want for 30, 40 plus years?
There's some of that for sure. When President Trump was in office, he did reduce the Grand Staircase Monument. He did reduce the Bears Ears Monument. But President Biden put them back.
Yeah.
So we're doing this seesaw back and forth, and it's just a nightmare. And that's why this management plan is getting addressed again, because after it was put back by Biden, they said, let's look at the plan again. And so they're looking at the plan again. And so if we keep doing this every election cycle, it's just going to be even that much worse. I supported the reduction for sure, but I think that Antiquities Act that you mentioned, it talks about the least amount of area possible that the federal government needs. 1.3, 1.8, just under 1 million acres is not the least amount.
It's a whole chunk.
Yeah, like if we want to protect some of these Native American sites, they're not on 1.3, 1.8. They're not everywhere out there. There was only water in certain areas at certain times a year. Those Native Americans didn't live in these vast grasslands that had no water. They were in some of the canyons in the winter when there was some rain and some snow. Other than that, they weren't there. They moved. They came and left.
Right. So we've got about 4 minutes left before we have to wrap. But what have you learned by speaking out by this? What advice would you have for people? You've been on Fox Business. You've been on NPR. You've been on a lot of big stations telling your story. What advice would you have for people on sticking your neck out and speaking out? And what would you ask other producers to do to get involved in the fight?
That's a great question. I think the key is to be willing to speak out. A lot of times, ranchers, we just want to do our thing and go to bed and wake up and take care of our animals and our families.
Yeah.
We just want to live our life and let people leave us alone and just feed America. But when we're pushed into these corners, the worst thing we can do is not fight back and not push back and not tell our story. We have to tell our story. We have to stick our neck out, as you put it. The main thing I think that we've learned is, even though how horrific that meeting was in Flagstaff and how frustrated and hot I was, good did come out of it. Because we pushed back in Flagstaff and in Kingman and told our story, they reduced the monument. We can't take all the credit. I know Utah Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau, Arizona Farm Bureau, and other ranchers did as well. But I have a lot of friends and family that were just like, why even try? Why fight? They're going to do what they do. Yeah. But I think that's the wrong attitude to have. I think you have to fight. I knew that if I didn't fight, I couldn't sleep at night.
Right.
Because I would just roll over and say, yep, make the monument. We'll just go away. Everyone can be happy. But I couldn't do that. Not for my wife and not for my children. Right. So I think it's important to push back. I think the key is with all of this, with all the farmers and ranchers, whether we ranch on private ground or on leased ground, whether it's privately leased or on state leases or federal leases, we're all in this together. What happens here affects everybody. You remove 12,000 AUMs off of a monument, that 2,000 head of cows isn't a big deal maybe in South Dakota or Oklahoma or Kansas, but out here in this country, that's a big deal. You take 2,000 calves out of a market on a given year, that really affects our market out here. So it is a big deal. And at the end of the day, those 2,000 cows belong to 30 different families or whatever. And that affects them individually and personally. It affects their private business. It affects how they take care of their family and how they can live in the community that they live in and raise their families the way they want to raise their families. It changes all of that. Yeah, I don't know anything.
And I think speaking out for sure, but also in the right way. I think it's easy to let emotions get the best of you and want to, but I think speaking out, being firm in what you believe in, don't roll over, but also doing it, taking the high road and in the right way. So.
Well, in the last 2 minutes here, you guys just totally captured what this podcast is all about, because I truly believe it comes down to protecting the individual families who are raising their kids on the land and being stewards of the natural resources, and raising the next generation that are going to lead this country, and in our efforts to be more efficient. And as corporate cronyism just takes over this country, seems like the little guy and the family just gets swept to the wayside, that they don't matter. But for us to have a truly secure food supply, we need a robust and diverse food system. And that means keeping as many families on the land as possible, doing what they do best. So thank you guys for the time today. And it was such a treat to meet you in person finally. And I just want to encourage you guys to stay in the fight, and God bless you both.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Amanda.